Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here this evening talking to you. And while we may not be able to avoid the upcoming solar eclipse, I'm here to talk about avoiding an eclipse of a different sort, what we call the eclipse of nature, actually, and how we can do that through conservation education and the concern we have for disappearing wildlife and natural resources out there. Simply put, conservation education is instructing individuals as to the wise use of nature and our natural resources. And through conservation and education in 3 simple steps, we can help empower individuals and avoid nature's eclipse. So the 3 steps are simple, right? We can provide training, provide opportunities, and provide resources. And when we think about providing these things, often we work in conservation education in areas where we deal with students, we deal with educators, we deal with professionals, conservation professionals, and community members. And often our programs are what we call interinstitutional, and where we form partnerships not only with institutions in the United States, but also when we work internationally, form partnerships with institutions in our host countries. And that's very important so that we can become equal stakeholders and have an equal vested interest in the process and the outcome. In areas that I've worked, a lot of them have a lot of things in common in specific geographic areas, and this is where a lot of conservation efforts are concentrated globally. They have several things in common. First of all, they're areas where we have what we call very high biodiversity, a wide variety of life forms on the planet, very high cultural diversity with a lot of different cultural groups, where we have large numbers of what we call endemic species, species that are found nowhere else on the planet, where we have large, impoverished, and disenfranchised populations of individuals, and where we have widespread habitat destruction, and where in those countries, often these 3 simple steps are lacking. So what I'd like to do for the next several minutes is, we are doing a lot of traveling this evening, I see, right? In space and time, okay? So we're gonna go on another trip. We're gonna go on a virtual trip for the next few minutes to a few of these locations. And I'll just highlight a few examples of the different kinds of conservation programs that I've had the great privilege to be involved in over the last years. I was thinking, how many years has that been? About 25 years. So here we go, right? Starting in Central America, in Guatemala, okay? And then we'll move to 2 areas in Nicaragua. Then we'll move to South America, to Venezuela, 2 areas in Venezuela. And then back to Central America, to Panama. So we are doing a lot of traveling in the next about 10 minutes, so. Okay. We'll start in Guatemala in an area called Huachactún. And Huachactún is a very significant ancient Mayan city, right? An ancient Mayan civilization. It is believed to be, this is one of the pyramids in Huachactún, it's believed to be home to the oldest Mayan astronomical observatory on Earth. So this is a remarkable area. And it also has high biodiversity, high cultural diversity, and large numbers of endangered species. And most people never make it to this remote area of Huachactún because they typically stop at an area called Tikal. I don't know if anyone has heard of Tikal. Tikal is one of the most famous Central American archaeological sites there is. It's one of the largest in Central America. It's home to the famous Mayan pyramids. So people usually stop there and they never make it to these more remote locations. So we decided that we would work here in Huachactún. And for these programs, for this one in particular, I worked with St. Louis University and University of Missouri St. Louis, and some of these institutions will sound familiar to some of you. And also Wildlife Conservation Society in Guatemala, and we put together a program of field conservation methods for advanced students, university level students, and those individuals that were either going into conservation or they were already conservation working professionals throughout Latin America, and provided a month-long field program for them. So here's, in addition to field work on a daily basis, this is one of our professors from St. Louis University working with students on ecological modeling, right? Certain computer programs allow you to be able to predict extinction probability, and he's working with them on this. But where our education programs don't really stop there, because one of the most significant things that we do, in my opinion, is when we go into these areas, I always like to go in, get to know the local community, and work with the local schools. So one of the components of our field programs is that our students then develop a set of conservation activities and lessons for the local schools. And here we are working in the local primary school in Washoktun. And our students get very creative. So they're given free rein. I guide them on development of their activities and lessons, but they have the opportunity to be very creative with what they present to the students. And this is a group that came in that presented their conservation program for the local school kids in Washoktun. And then, very creative, they said, we want to go back a couple of days later and we're going to dress as tourists, and that's why they have the hats and the sunglasses on, and ask the students to talk to them and relate what they had learned from their presentation and act as though they were their tour guides for this significant area. And what we hear from teachers when we go into these areas is that our time spent in these schools is significant to the students. It helps give them a sense of pride in their area, that we care enough about them to go and learn about them and spend time with them. It also helps instill sort of this sense of ownership and building relationship with nature and natural resources that we know is integral if we want to save those resources in the future. Okay. In Nicaragua, a different example of a conservation program and conservation education program. I worked and lived in Nicaragua for some time, and I worked in an area called Bosawas, and it was dedicated as a biosphere reserve by UNESCO, the United Nations, some years back, because it is home to about 20,000 indigenous people. The Mosquito and the Mayangna indigenous groups still live in this area in 6 tribal territories. And it is a biosphere reserve because of the indigenous populations, and also it's considered to have some of the most pristine tropical forest until you get into the Amazon in South America. It's a remote area in Nicaragua on the Honduran border, so this is the Coco River, and that's the only way you get to some of our remote sites where we worked, was 3 days by dugout boat, getting to some of the remote locations where the Mosquito people live. And our goal here was multifaceted. We worked with the St. Louis Zoo, directed this program. We worked with the Missouri Botanical Gardens, St. Louis University, the Nature Conservancy, and USAID, and put together a program to help the Mosquito and the Mayangna people develop a conservation management plan for their tribal lands. And so different components of this program, I highlight a couple, this is one of our field people, and she helped train the indigenous people to be able to, in field conservation techniques, and then we employed the indigenous individuals to work on programs with us. So they were actually participants in the development of their own conservation management plan. In addition, St. Louis Zoo worked with the local schools in these tribal villages and developed conservation education workshops for the local tribal teachers, and then conservation education materials for the kids to use. And again, here's one of our field people working with one of the older individuals in one of the tribal areas and the kids in that community. Okay. Still in Nicaragua, in an area called Ometepe. And Ometepe is an island in the middle of Lago Nicaragua, one of the largest lakes I think that we have in the world. And there are a series of islands located here. And this is, it houses 2 volcanoes. This is one of the volcanoes. This is Volcano Concepcion. In this island called Ometepe, we have what's called the Ometepe Biological Field Station. And in this area, I worked on a month-long field conservation program for university students from the United States. So I took university students down for a month. They learned field conservation methods. And again, in this case, we wanted to do community education. And so we did it a little differently this time. It was really what I consider to be true community outreach. We went into the local community on the island, and people found out that we were at the field station and that our students were doing conservation. They were working on field projects, and they got really excited about the opportunity to come to the field station. They'd never been there before. So word got out that we were going to invite people to the field station and have a day where they could engage in conservation lessons, activities. We play games. We usually play soccer. We have a meal together. And so my students then set up displays and talked to them about different aspects of conservation. So there were so many people from the village that wanted to come. We actually hired a cattle truck and drove around the island and picked up families, right? Brought them to the field station for the day. They got to spend the day with us, and then we took them all back home at the end of the day. Okay, moving to South America, a slightly different take on conservation education. In an area called the Caparo Forestry Reserve. It houses a very important biodiversity reserve. This is located close to the Colombian border in South America. And this is the Caparo River. We have pristine rainforest, lots of endangered species. And for some years, I lived and worked in Venezuela. And I worked with the individual you see who's talking to the students there, Miguel Elija and I. He's from the University of the Andes in Venezuela. He and I developed a program for university students from not only the United States, but Venezuela as well. So we had a cross-cultural month-long experience for the students in which they learned conservation field methods. Okay, so they got to learn not only from university professors in the United States, from Cleveland State University, different institutions, but also from professors in Venezuela. Also in Venezuela, but in a different area of Venezuela, and that's not a student or a teacher or a community member. It's a community member, it's a different one. Does anybody know what that is by any chance? Andean condor, yes it is, Andean condor. Andean condors are arguably the largest, most robust bird of flight on the planet, right? They're enormous. And unfortunately, they're becoming endangered. They're threatened in most of their range, especially in this area in Venezuela where I lived and worked. So one of the components of one of our conservation programs was working on Andean condor conservation. And so we coupled Cleveland Metro Park Zoo, we coupled with conservation organizations in Venezuela and jumped on board with Andean condor breeding and reintroduction programs back into the Andes Mountains in Venezuela. And here we are, that's a few of us standing out there with binoculars. So we're eyeballing, right, watching condors, the remaining condors there. They're bred at this site, and then they're released through a slow, soft release program back out into the wild, and then they're monitored there. And there were so few condors left when we started getting involved with this program that we thought it was really important to develop a conservation education component to that. And I took a slightly different angle on this. I started working in the Andes Mountains still, but in a zoo, okay, called Choros de Mia Zoo. And this is from inside the zoo, and it overlooks the highest point in the Venezuelan Andes Mountains, Pico Bolivar. It's a beautiful setting. And this zoo is one of the most heavily visited zoos in the country. And I've mentioned several zoos so far, and what zoos have become is centers of conservation, right? Education centers, research centers, conservation centers, and our St. Louis Zoo is no different in that regard. So this is heavily visited, a lot of visitation, and that sets up the perfect opportunity to be able to educate people about conservation efforts. So I worked with the local agencies, conservation agencies in this area, and zoo personnel, and we developed a set of displays and conservation materials for the visitors that they could implement for zoo visitors. And one of those components was an education program dealing with Andean condor conservation and the breeding and reintroduction efforts, and coupling that with the historical significance and cultural significance of Andean condors because they are very symbolic in most of Central American Andean countries. Okay, and lastly, moving to Panama, to Isla Colón, and working with the Nobe people in this area. And this is an aerial view of Isla Colón. It still has pristine tropical forest, a large indigenous population, mangrove forests, very important for reproduction of aquatic organisms, lots of endemic species that are found there and nowhere else. And this island is part of what's called an archipelago, a group of islands in Bocas del Toro, and it is considered to be the Galapagos of Central America in its biological significance. So here for about 6 or 7 years, I worked every year doing a month-long field program for university students from the United States, and some were open to students from other countries, where again, we train them in field conservation methods. And then a component of their program always is taking that information and knowledge and sharing it with the local communities, in this case, the local Nobe community. We invited the school kids to the field station for a day, again, provided meal, provided games, displays, demonstrations, and then engaged in a beach cleanup day. A lot of these communities make their living from the ocean, and ocean pollution has become an increasingly significant problem for us globally. And again, this idea of keeping the area clean, instilling a sense of pride, and this idea of ownership and stewardship for the natural resources. Okay. And since then, I've continued to go down to Panama. So I go down every year, 2 years. I've known the teachers and the kids in these schools for a very long time. I've known their brothers, big brothers and sisters, and the little kids that come after them, and continue to do conservation programs working with them. Here's a couple, right? Most recently I went down, and we have to be creative and use different resources that are applicable to these teachers, that with activities they can replicate, right, and keep using. So for the web of life, teaching the interconnectedness of nature, I just came with a ball of twine and pictures from calendars of wildlife that I had saved over a long period of time, and was able to teach the idea of the web of life and the importance of connectedness of one life form to another out there. And then this is just an activity, right, teaching them a dance and a way to remember the important parts of plants and the role plants play out there in nature, right? Okay, and this is a picture of the school kids most recently when I was down there. What we also try to do is always pool money and purchase supplies, because resources are sorely lacking in a lot of these areas. In this Nobe area, it's not uncommon that students go to about 4th grade, maybe 6th grade, and they often lack supplies. They don't have pencils, they don't have anything to write with. The teachers lack materials, so we always make sure we provide materials for them, students and the teachers. And I know it's typical for us from the United States to like to take things down to those countries, but one of the things that we always try to do is purchase locally, and that helps strengthen local economies, and that's important in these areas. And it doesn't all happen just far away. One of my classes here at the college, my Ecology and Environmental Conservation class, as their service learning project one semester, we worked with the local Hillsborough primary school and the school teachers. And our class developed what we call the Nature Trail Eco Guide for the primary school teachers to use with the outdoor classroom that they have here locally. And when we educate individuals, we empower them, and hopefully we can help future generations avoid nature's eclipse. Thank you.